Hi everyone, I'm Vicky Hewlett. I'm the Head of Marketing and Comms at Give a Little, and before James and Delaney kick off with the presentation, I just thought I'd just let you know who we are, just for context. So yeah, we are all about cashless and contactless giving, and we are a mission-led organisation that aims to be the most easy to use, flexible and affordable way for charities to access cashless. It's our mission to minimise those costs for charities, and just to say that we are part funded by our parent company, which is a digital transformation consultancy that primarily they are transforming the government at the moment, and we get to kind of borrow some of our colleagues, including Delaney, who is UX designer. So just to give you that information. And so again, for context, so we currently work with over 7,500 charities. And last week we hit a very exciting milestone of helping the charities in our community raise £30 million in cashless donations, and that is predominantly contactless. It took, we always like to say, it took 3 years to help charities raise 10, then 11 months to help them raise the second 10, and just 7.5 months to raise the third 10 million to 30, which just shows how quickly that adoption in cashless is growing. And then just moving on, just for context again, to explain the different ways that charities currently use Give a Little. So that could be online giving and QR codes. And then moving on to contactless, there are a whole range of options for contactless. So we provide the software, that works on a number of partner hardware devices. We recently launched something called Tap on Phone, which allows charities to take donations on an Android smartphone without the need for an additional card reader. And then we also allow charities, in line with our affordability mission, to sort of build their own DIY point of donation by combining an Android device with either a SumUp or a Stripe card reader. And that picture of a theatre there just shows the sort of things that charities do with our DIY approach. And yeah, so this presentation is all about the admin account. So we obviously provide a lot of reports for charities. We're always advising charities to really get involved with the data, to test and learn, look at what's working, look at what their average donation values are, that kind of thing, because then they can maximise their fundraising and make even more. So I think that was my last slide, and I'm moving on to James now to go into the UX side of things.
Yeah, thank you, Vicky. I just thought it'd be good to have a little intro so you have a better understanding of, who Give a Little are and what we do. So hopefully the rest of the talk will make a little bit more sense. But as the intro said, the main focus of this talk is to take you all through a recent UX project that we worked on, from discovery all the way through to launch, and to go over some of the UX principles that we followed, particularly because as a SaaS startup, I think we might do some things slightly different to some of you, which will hopefully be interesting and spark some discussion, hopefully. So the first kind of notable difference that I think probably separates our approach from maybe some of you is that predominantly we follow the lean UX methodology, which is complementary but fundamentally distinct to agile. I think probably most people use agile. So as most of you will be aware, agile is all about being flexible, adaptable, and responsive to change, and this is what lends itself nicely to that iterative design and build approach. Lean also adopts the same iterative design and build approach, but for a different reason. So the ultimate goal when using lean is to create a system that emphasizes maximizing and delivering value, but at the same time minimizing waste. And the reason that we follow lean predominantly is because a key part of our mission is to minimize the cost for charities moving to cashless fundraising, not fundless, hopefully, and also to be sustainable. And by sustainable, I mean financially sustainable, so that we can stay in the market for a long time, so that charities can rely on us and depend on us, who are using our service. This lean approach kind of shows up in one key place is in our discovery and in our user need prioritization process. So we implement a technique called continuous discovery. We primarily do this so that we can speed up the discovery process, but it is actually becoming more popular in agile workflows as well, because it is quite useful. So as the name suggests, the kind of principle of running continuous discovery is that you are discovering and prioritizing your users' needs all the time. So not just in planning phases or at the beginning of an epic. And we achieve this by having regular touch points with all of our customer segments and user groups that are kind of shown on the screen, ideally with each of those groups at least once a month. And another thing that we do is that all of us in the team, including the UX and actually the devs, are all responsible for handling the support requests that come into us as a company. And this gives us a really amazing oversight over all the problems and the needs that our users have in kind of real time. The benefit for us is that it cuts out a huge amount of that time and speculation in planning for our roadmap, as we always have a really good idea of which improvements will deliver the most value to our users at any given point in time whilst meeting our objectives. So in the example of this project, as Give a Little grew and charities were using Give a Little more and more extensively, through these conversations that we're having in these regular touch points, we noticed that there was a building number of requests, and also we noticed people were performing a lot of workarounds to get the reporting data that they needed from the campaigns they were running. And therefore, sorry, is that a question from James? I don't know if you had your hand up or not. Oh no, sorry, I thought you had your hand up. And yeah, sorry, and then it became obvious that an overhaul of the campaign reporting pages was becoming more of a priority, which Delaney will go into now.
Yeah, so yeah, as James mentioned, we knew that there was some issues with the campaign reporting. So one of those issues, well, the reason that we kind of had those issues was that Give a Little scaled quite quickly. So initially we were working with smaller charities, for example, like Jane Scarth House, who you see on the screen, who took part in our research. But we gained clients like Cancer Research UK, for example, and our initial reporting feature was kind of set up for these smaller scale charities. And as we got these bigger charities, it was no longer fit for purpose. So if you go to the next slide, that was our initial design. So it was quite simple. There was a graph showing the total amount that was raised for each campaign that you were running, and then a list that showed the campaigns you were running, the number of donations for that campaign, and the value of that campaign, so how much you'd raised in total, which worked totally fine if you only had a few campaigns that you were running and they all raised a relatively similar amount to one another. Oh yeah, sorry, I should also mention that there was this on the dashboard, and then the charities could download a spreadsheet that had like all the data in it. So Give a Little gets, because we're taking cashless donations, quite a lot of information. So it was all kind of in the spreadsheet and charities could use it however they wanted. I think mostly it was getting used for financials, like people doing account keeping and bookkeeping. So this setup worked fine for that. But if you go to the next slide, all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. once you've got, like, if you're a Cancer Research UK who's got, you know, tens of campaigns, or some charities have, you know, going up into the high, you know, 90s, or like Vicky might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some charities have quite a lot of campaigns, and this was absolutely not built for that. So as you can see, you can't actually see any of your campaigns anymore. If you've got drastically different values that you're raising amongst your campaigns. So if you can see on this slide, the biggest campaign has raised over £20,000, whereas you've got £5 at the other end of the spectrum, and the graph wasn't really built to handle that kind of difference. And this was also a problem with the long list underneath, because charities, if they were bigger, they had to scroll for a really long time to find it. And the information on the table was also being repeated in the list. So you were getting the same information twice, which wasn't necessarily what people needed. And we had all this useful data sitting in the spreadsheet, but it was relying on user motivation, skill, and knowledge to access that, which isn't accessible. So yeah, sorry, next slide. So as I mentioned before, we did interviewing with those charities on that first slide. And we kind of tried to target people who are actually using the dashboard. So they had roles like treasurer, they could volunteer, operations manager, program manager. And we did guided interviews to get a sense of what their reporting habits were. So what data would be more useful to them? What were they using the spreadsheet for right now, if they were using it at all? If they weren't using it, why weren't they using it? What was their data literacy? So were they using data at the moment to make decisions about their campaigns to kind of increase their donations? Or did they not really know where to start? Was it something that they wanted to do but didn't really know how to do? And really importantly, what did big charities and small charities have in common? So we needed to understand what needs cut across all user segments, because we're not just working with churches, we're also working with museums, we're also working with, healthcare related charities. And we're also working with charities that are almost exclusively volunteers compared to massive organizations with a different set of resources. So we couldn't just design for this feature to cater to the largest or the smallest charities. Everyone had to kind of get the most out of it. So we were also looking for which improvements, like following the lean approach, would have the biggest improvement and the highest impact with the least amount of change or work up front. So yeah, we were looking for high impact off the bat. So next, what kind of came out of that, those initial interviews, was we found that there were two kind of major high level needs that all the charities seemed to have in common. One was reporting at a high level, so using kind of more high level totals for campaigns to kind of talk to managers and stakeholders. And the other was using more granular information to understand actually how their campaigns worked and to make adjustments to increase donations. So what was a big difference from what we initially were offering compared to what they wanted us to offer was a granular analysis of a single campaign. So they were looking for things like total income of that campaign, average donation value, number of donations given altogether, the number of donations for each value. So for example, if they had presets of 5, 10 and 15 pounds, they want to know how many people gave 10 pounds, how many people gave 5 pounds, and how much did they actually raise monetarily per value. They also wanted to be able to compare campaigns. They wanted to be able to track their income over time. And they wanted to be able to compare periods. So like, did the amount we raised this year, was it as good as the same time last year? And with the spreadsheet, that was a big pain point for them. They said all the information was there, but it was hard to get to. And for some users, they actually weren't accessing the insights at all, because the spreadsheet was just too difficult to work with and they didn't have the time. So there was definitely an appetite for visual data on the screen and to get insights at a glance. And we also found, which was quite interesting, some charities were actually already using the spreadsheet to generate their own visualizations of income over time. So that was something that we definitely wanted to bring to them on the screen, take out the work for them. So next slide. So once we'd kind of extracted all of that, we kind of came up with this list of user needs and started to prioritize them in terms of what would be the most valuable to the user and absolutely essential to put on the screen.
Yeah, so this discovery deep dive process introduces, a classic problem for anyone working in UX. I think especially when you're kind of like early or earlier stage startup, is that you have this enormous list of user needs, even for a single feature like this, that's far too long to commit to everything. So obviously prioritization is another continuous process that you do throughout the UX journey, so at a very high level and also at a very granular level. But I always use kind of the same principles in my prioritization. So I thought I'd share that here using the example of these user needs. I always use the method of just looking at a matrix of the amount of value that we believe the feature will introduce for the user, the amount of effort that is required to implement it, and then how much uncertainty is there in either understanding what the value is or understanding the effort. And again, in Lean, we can be quite direct in this process and not worry too much about the fine details. If there is quite a lot of uncertainty, often, we'll then just drop that need. Unless we think it is really, really high value, then we might go in and dig a bit deeper. But again, we're really focusing on delivering value as quickly as possible. So with things like uncertainty, we're quite brutal with. So again, in this example, we had this long laundry list of needs, and what we quickly saw that these were largely grouped into two groups. So one was reporting needs, which was where charities needed simple ways to actually see what had happened with their fundraising. And then there was a number of analysis needs, which was where charities wanted ways to understand why certain things had happened so that they could, improve and do better next time. With the reporting needs in general, these were much more kind of mission critical. They needed to report data for example, reconciling accounts or reporting back to their team. Whereas analysis, whilst really important, was usually not critical. It was just how can they improve their process. So it's quite simple for us to prioritize the reporting needs over the analytics needs and focus on getting the reporting done first. Which cut out a load of these kind of user leads and made it a lot more kind of made it easier to commit to. And then also it at the same time drastically reduced the effort because by grouping all the reporting together, a lot of the design and the build elements were a lot more similar. So it was a lot more efficient process. So this is how we kind of split up and prioritize what we were then going to focus on.
Yeah, so then we moved into prototyping. So basically we knew what data needed to be displayed on the screens, but we didn't know the best way to show it. So prototyping was us trying to work out the best way to actually visually depict each piece of data that we wanted to give to the charities. So as we said before, there was a need for the granular analysis or to look at a single campaign in more depth. So that was kind of the first thing that was a big change from the initial design. We needed to have two pages, one where you could see campaigns and select a campaign, and then another page to drill down into that specific campaign. So this here is some of the testing for the first page, the campaign selection page, where they needed to see all the campaigns, get a high level insight for each campaign at a glance, select an individual campaign, and then we had some concepts that we wanted to test, like grouping. So larger charities might have 5 or 6 campaigns that all belong to the same cause. And then for those larger charities as well, they also had like filtering that they wanted to kind of play around with. So we were testing that as well. And then on the second page, it was more about testing graph styles. So testing what was visually most understandable. And testing the upper and lower limits of the graph. So if we have huge, like a huge disparity between the lowest and the highest amount raised, or if one person gave £1 but 57 people gave £100, how are we going to show that on the same graph and have people actually understand it? And then we tested the concepts, like how would we actually build a graph where you could compare campaigns and select the campaigns that you want to compare. How can you compare time periods, and should we introduce an idea like comparing to the Give a Little average? Would that be a good idea? What would that look like? And if one of the big things a lot of charities spoke about was wanting to understand how much income each device raised, so they could see, oh, in this location we do really well, in this location we don't do as well. Why is that? But that's a lot more tricky in terms of visualizing the information. So we spent a lot of time also trying to work out how we could show that information. So nothing that you see on the screen actually made it into the final design. They were just some examples of the tests to see what worked. actually would do a little bit of impromptu user testing with this as well, like turn around to the person behind me in the office and say, do you understand this? What do you think this graph is trying to tell you? So even though we couldn't necessarily reach out to users, to our intended users, we could just kind of ask on the fly and get some feedback quickly, which really speeds the process along. Next slide. So yeah, then into the high fidelity prototyping was we needed to validate basically everything we'd kind of heard, interpreted, channeled into a visual design. We needed to check that users got it. So page 1 was about the campaign selection. Despite all those tests, we went back to the old table format because it's just a lot more easy to digest. We added some data to it. So we added number of donations, average donation value, and the total. So it's a lot easier to show all that information in just the table, and we ditched the graph because A, it was hard to reconcile across all different charity sizes, and B, it gave the exact same information that the table did. So with the table, it wasn't broke, so we didn't fix it, but we did improve it. And then we added the ability to click. So the next one is when you click on a specific campaign, it'll take you to this more in-depth version, which we tried to kind of establish like a hierarchy of data. So at the very top, the high level stuff that you might want to just access really quickly. So the amount you've raised, the number of donations you've got, the average donation value, how much is gift aid eligible. I can't remember what else. There's 6 different things up there. But then we also had some concepts that people didn't say they wanted explicitly, but we thought would be a good idea. And we wanted to see if it was a good idea. So you have this bar at the top of the screen, which was to show a forecast or a goal, either one. So if the charity had set a goal of £1,000, how close were they to that? Or if they had raised in this period £50 and we're working as a forecast in 6 months' time, how much do we think that they'll raise if they stay on this trajectory? And we wanted to just litmus test it with the charities if that could be useful. And then going further down, income over time, because that was such a big one. So we need that graph. And then further down again, the kind of donation amount graphs. And we spent, I don't know if I mentioned that. Oh yeah, I did kind of mention that. We spent a lot of time making sure those graphs would work if you had a campaign where there was only 2 values compared to 7 values. I don't think there's anything more to say on that. James.
So once we were happy with the prototype, which Delaney's explaining involved lots of different iterations, we then finished with another round of testing. So this time it was specifically moderated usability testing. So we had a clickable prototype. To test this, we would frame a scenario based on the user's own needs. So by asking them something like, when was the last time you needed to report back your campaign data to your team? And then through that framed scenario, we would then ask them to complete the task using the clickable prototype to understand how effective the prototype was in addressing that need. We actually found from this first round of testing that the designs were extremely usable, which was down to Delaney's good designing. So we were quite confident that we could move forward to the build phase. But obviously, if we had any problems or users could not complete the task at this stage, we would have iterated the designs, gone back and then retested until our confidence was high enough to proceed. Moving from design to build is probably also where we might differ from the traditional agile approach, in that at this point we want to deliver the value as quickly as possible. For example, if changes to the design came up in this build phase, which can happen quite often because engineers and designers are using very different tools for their work, we wouldn't normally kind of go back and do a big redesign unless it was really major. We would normally let the developers kind of use their own judgment to a certain extent. But we did in this case actually have one example where we did need to kind of go back and push it back to design, which is shown on the screen here. So the original design intended to have this kind of metric data and the graph of donations over time all above the fold on a desktop screen. This was built and worked in Figma, but then when we built it using the kind of CSS components that our developers used, the graph actually sat below the fold, and it wasn't entirely obvious, we thought, that you could scroll down and actually see more information. So this we pushed back and came up with a more compact solution for having those metrics, which you can see on the right, to overcome this problem, and then push that back to the developers to build. And then finally, so once the feature is launched, we go right back to the beginning of the circle, and we're able to monitor the impact and feedback from users through the same continuous discovery process that's been running throughout this entire journey. And through this, we're able to gather, how much value the feature has actually provided to our users. And in this case, we were quite positively overwhelmed by the feedback, which I think was likely to happen because it was a massive improvement from what was there before, which you would have seen. And what was really nice to see is that some of the feedback we got was from Cancer Research, who were one of the users who had been using Give a Little the most extensively and having the most problems and have the most workarounds. And they came back to us to say how beneficial the new designs were in reducing the amount of time taken to report the key data from their fundraising, because they were doing fundraising across high value events, community events, face-to-face fundraising, and corporate partnerships. So it's really good to see that was kind of our primary use case of why to improve this in the first place. And they came back and actually said that it was generating a lot of value. So on that positive note, that's the end. And hopefully there's some stuff in there that was kind of interesting and can spark some discussion.